The evening sun was starting to dip behind the tall buildings of the city when a silver sedan pulled into the crowded parking lot of the Grand Oak Hotel. Inside the car sat a woman in her mid-30s, her hands resting on the steering wheel even though the engine had already been turned off. She stared at the entrance of the hotel for a long moment, watching guests in fancy clothes walk through the glass doors. Some of them carried gift bags. Others laughed loudly, already in a celebratory mood. She took a deep breath and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror one last time. Her name was Lucia Reyes, and she had driven nearly 3 hours to be here tonight. Her younger cousin, Anna, was getting engaged, and the family had rented out the hotel's grand ballroom for the occasion. It was supposed to be a big, joyful gathering, the kind where relatives you hadn't seen in years would suddenly appear and ask why you looked so tired, or why you still weren't married yet. Lucia wasn't looking forward to those questions. She stepped out of the car and smoothed down her dress. It was a simple thing, dark blue with small white flowers along the hem. She had bought it from a clearance rack 2 weeks ago, unsure if it was too plain for such a fancy event. But it was comfortable, and after working double shifts at the hospital all week, comfort was all she really cared about. Lucia worked as a nurse in the emergency department of a community hospital about 40 miles outside the city. It wasn't a glamorous job. The hours were brutal, the pay was decent but not great, and the emotional toll was something most people couldn't understand unless they had lived it themselves. She had held the hands of strangers in their final moments. She had delivered news that changed families forever. And then, when her shift was over, she would drive home in silence, heat up leftover rice and beans, and fall asleep on her couch with the television still on. That was her life. Quiet, predictable, invisible. She walked through the hotel lobby and followed the signs toward the ballroom. Even from a distance, she could hear the music, a live band playing something upbeat and cheerful. The hallway smelled like fresh flowers and expensive perfume. When she finally reached the entrance, a young woman at a small table smiled at her and asked for her name. Lucia Reyes, I'm Anna's cousin. The woman checked her list and nodded. Welcome. You're at table 14, near the back. Of course she was. Lucia stepped inside and immediately felt out of place. The ballroom was enormous, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and round tables covered in white cloth and gold centerpieces. Guests moved around the room in elegant dresses and tailored suits, laughing and hugging and clinking glasses of champagne. A few children ran between the tables, chased by tired-looking parents. In the corner, near a large window, stood a beautiful grand piano. It was black and shiny under the lights, and a young man in a vest sat behind it, playing soft background music that no one seemed to be paying attention to. Lucia found her table and sat down. There were a few other people already seated, distant relatives she vaguely recognized but couldn't name. They smiled politely at her and then went back to their own conversations. She didn't mind. She preferred it that way. A waiter came by and offered her a glass of wine. She shook her head and asked for water instead. She had to drive back tonight. And besides, alcohol always made her feel too loose, too open. She needed her walls up in a room like this. As the evening went on, Lucia watched from her seat at the back. She saw Anna, glowing in a white dress, standing next to her fiancé and greeting guests one by one. She saw her Aunt Carmen, Anna's mother, moving through the crowd like a queen, making sure everything was perfect. She saw old uncles telling the same jokes they had been telling for 30 years. She saw cousins she used to play with as a child, now grown up with children of their own. And she saw the piano. She kept looking at it, even when she tried not to. It sat there in the corner like an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years. The young pianist was good, technically skilled, pleasant to listen to, but there was something missing in his playing. It was too safe, too polished, like he was afraid to make a mistake. Lucia's fingers moved slightly against her thigh, pressing invisible keys in time with the music. She didn't even realize she was doing it until a voice broke through her thoughts. Lucia, you made it. She looked up and saw Aunt Carmen standing over her, arms open wide. Lucia stood and accepted the hug, smelling the familiar scent of her aunt's floral perfume. Of course I came. I wouldn't miss Anna's engagement. You look thin, Aunt Carmen said, holding her at arm's length and studying her face. Are you eating? Are you sleeping? You work too hard, Mija. I'm fine, Tia. Really. Aunt Carmen didn't look convinced, but she let it go. She glanced around the room, then back at Lucia. Come. Come. Don't sit back here like a stranger. Come say hello to everyone. For the next hour, Lucia was pulled from group to group, forced to smile and make small talk with people she barely remembered. Yes. She was still working at the hospital. No, she wasn't seeing anyone. Yes, the drive was long but not too bad. No, she didn't know when she would visit again. By the time she managed to slip away, her cheeks hurt from smiling, and her feet ached from standing in heels she wasn't used to wearing. She found a quiet corner near the bar and leaned against the wall, grateful for a moment of peace. That's when she noticed the piano was empty. The young pianist had stepped away, probably for a break, and the grand instrument sat alone, its keys waiting in silence. A few guests wandered over and pressed a note or two, laughing at themselves before walking away. One man tried to play a simple melody but gave up after a few seconds. Lucia watched all of this with a strange ache in her chest. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. A kind of longing that she had buried so deep she had almost forgotten it was there. She had been 8 years old the first time she touched a piano. It was at her grandmother's house, an old upright instrument with yellow keys and a slightly out-of-tune sound. But to young Lucia, it was magic. She had pressed a single key and listened to the note hang in the air, and something inside her had clicked into place. By the time she was 12, she was winning local competitions. By 15, she was being called a prodigy. Teachers said she had a gift. Not just technical ability, but something deeper. She could make the piano sing. She could make it cry. She could tell stories with nothing but her hands and 88 keys. But life had other plans. Now, standing in that grand ballroom at 34 years old, Lucia Reyes was just a tired nurse in a clearance rack dress, watching strangers fumble with an instrument she had once loved more than anything in the world. She told herself to look away, to go back to her table, to forget. But her eyes stayed on the piano, and her fingers kept moving against her thigh, playing a song only she could hear. Lucia didn't know how long she had been standing there, watching the empty piano from across the room. It could have been 2 minutes, or 20. Time seemed to move differently. When that old longing crept back into her chest, she was so lost in her own thoughts that she didn't notice Aunt Carmen approaching until a hand landed firmly on her shoulder. There you are. I've been looking everywhere for you. Lucia blinked and turned to face her aunt. Sorry, Tia. I just needed a little break from all the conversations. Lucia. Lucia blinked and turned to face. Aunt Carmen waved her hand like she was brushing away a fly. Nonsense. Your family. You don't need to hide in corners. She paused and followed Lucia's gaze toward the piano. A small smile crossed her face. Ah, you're looking at the piano. I was just. It's a beautiful instrument. It is, Aunt Carmen agreed. The hotel is very proud of it. They say it cost more than most cars. She tilted her head and studied Lucia with curious eyes. You used to play, didn't you, when you were younger? I remember your mother talking about it all the time. She said you were gifted. Lucia felt her stomach tighten. She hadn't expected the conversation to go in this direction. That was a long time ago, Tia. I haven't played seriously in years. But you still remember how, yes? I mean, I suppose, a little. But I'm really out of practice. Aunt Carmen's eyes lit up in a way that made Lucia nervous. She knew that look. It was the same look her aunt got when she was about to volunteer someone for something they didn't want to do. The pianist, Aunt Carmen said, gesturing toward the empty bench. He's taking a break. Something about needing fresh air, but the room feels so quiet without music, don't you think? It's an engagement party. There should be music. I'm sure he'll be back soon. But what if he takes too long? People are starting to notice the silence. Aunt Carmen grabbed Lucia's hand and began pulling her toward the piano. Come. Just play something simple. Background music. Nothing fancy. Just until the young man returns. Lucia's heart began to pound. Tia. I really don't think. Please, Mija. For Anna, for the family, just a few minutes. They were already halfway across the room. A few guests glanced in their direction, curious about where the older woman was dragging the quiet nurse. Lucia wanted to pull her hand free and walk away. She wanted to make an excuse about needing to use the restroom or check on her car. But the words wouldn't come. They got stuck somewhere between her chest and her throat, and before she knew it, she was standing right next to the piano. It was even more beautiful up close. The black surface was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the golden light of the chandeliers above. The keys were pristine, white and black in perfect rows, waiting to be touched. Lucia could smell the faint scent of wood and polish. And for a moment, she was 8 years old again, standing in her grandmother's living room, reaching up to press her first note. Sit, sit, Aunt Carmen urged, guiding her onto the bench. Lucia sat down slowly. The bench was the perfect height. She didn't even need to adjust it. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. She hadn't sat at a piano like this in so long. The ones at the hospital chapel were old and worn, with sticky keys and dull sound. This was something else entirely. This was a concert-quality instrument. The kind she used to dream about owning someday. Here, said a voice beside her. Lucia looked up and saw a young woman, one of the event coordinators, holding out a piece of sheet music. It was a simple love ballad. The kind that got played at every wedding and engagement party across the country. Easy chords, predictable melody, the sort of song that faded into the background and made people feel warm without really listening. This is what the pianist was playing earlier, the coordinator said. It's a crowd favorite. Lucia took the sheet music and placed it on the stand in front of her. She stared at the notes, her trained eyes reading them instantly. It was basic, almost too basic. A beginner could play this with a few weeks of practice. But maybe that was a good thing. Maybe basic was safe. She became aware that a few people nearby had stopped talking and were watching her. Not many, most of the guests were still absorbed in their own conversations, but enough to make her palms sweat. She wiped them quickly on her dress and placed her fingers on the keys. The first note rang out, clear and soft. Then the second. Then the third. She played the song exactly as it was written, note for note, measure for measure. Her fingers moved carefully, almost timidly, like she was afraid the piano might bite her if she pressed too hard. The melody floated through the room, pleasant and unremarkable. A few guests nodded along without really paying attention. Others continued their conversations as if nothing had changed. Aunt Carmen stood nearby, smiling proudly. Beautiful, she whispered. See? I knew you still had it. But Lucia didn't feel beautiful. She felt like a fraud, like she was wearing a costume that didn't fit anymore. The music coming from her fingers was correct, technically speaking, but it was empty. There was no soul in it, no fire. It was like reading a poem in a language you didn't understand. You could pronounce all the words, but you couldn't feel their meaning. She kept playing, her eyes fixed on the sheet music even though she didn't really need it. The song was so simple that her hands could have played it in her sleep, but she kept her gaze locked on those black notes because looking anywhere else felt too dangerous. If she looked at the keys, she might remember how much she loved them. If she looked at the crowd, she might see pity in their eyes. And if she looked inside herself, she might find all the grief and regret she had spent 15 years trying to bury. So she played it safe. Note by note, measure by measure, like a machine. Halfway through the second verse, something strange happened. A child ran past the piano, laughing loudly, chased by an older sibling. The sudden noise broke Lucia's concentration, and her fingers stumbled for just a moment. She hit a wrong note, a sharp where there should have been a natural, and the dissonance rang out like a crack in glass. She froze. The world seemed to stop for a split second. Then, without thinking, her left hand moved on its own, adding a bass note that turned the mistake into something intentional. A jazz chord, rich and unexpected. It didn't belong in the simple love ballad at all, but somehow, it worked. Lucia blinked. Her heart was beating faster now. That chord had come from somewhere deep inside her. From a place she thought she had locked away forever. It was like a door had cracked open, just a tiny bit, and light was starting to spill through. She looked down at her hands. They were still resting on the keys, waiting. The sheet music sat in front of her. But suddenly, it felt like a cage. A set of rules someone else had written. A box she had put herself in because she was too scared to remember what freedom felt like. The guests were still chatting. No one had noticed the strange chord. No one was paying attention to the quiet woman at the piano. But Lucia noticed, and for the first time in 15 years, she felt something stir inside her chest. Something that had been sleeping for a very long time. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling. The sheet music told her to play the chorus again, soft and sweet, just like before. But her hands wanted something else. They wanted to fly. For a long moment, Lucia sat completely still. Her fingers rested on the keys, feeling the cool ivory beneath her skin. The accidental jazz chord still echoed in her mind. A reminder of who she used to be. The sheet music in front of her waited patiently, telling her exactly what to play next. A simple chorus. Safe notes. The kind of music that would blend into the background and be forgotten by morning. But something inside her had shifted. It was like a crack had appeared in a dam she had built years ago, and now water was starting to leak through. Not a flood, not yet, but enough to make her realize the dam wasn't as strong as she thought. All those years of pushing music away, of telling herself she had made the right choice, of pretending the piano didn't matter anymore, it had all been a lie. The truth was sitting right there in her chest, beating alongside her heart. She missed it. God, she missed it so much. Her eyes drifted closed. She couldn't remember the last time she had played with her eyes closed. When she was younger, before everything changed, she used to do it all the time. Her teachers said it was a sign of true connection when you trusted your hands so completely that you didn't need to watch them. When the music lived inside you instead of on a page, the room around her seemed to fade away. The chatter of the guests became a distant hum. The clinking of glasses and the shuffling of feet turned into white noise. All that existed was Lucia and the piano, alone together after 15 years apart. Her left hand moved first. It was subtle at first, just a slight change in the bass line. Instead of the simple two-note pattern written on the sheet music, she added a walking rhythm, low notes climbing up and down like footsteps on a staircase. It was a technique she had learned as a teenager, something from the jazz records her grandmother used to play on Sunday afternoons. Then her right hand followed. The melody was still there, recognizable, but she began to bend it. She added grace notes, tiny flickers of sound that decorated the main tune like ornaments on a Christmas tree. She stretched some notes longer and cut others short. She played with the rhythm, pushing and pulling against the beat in a way that made the music breathe. A few guests near the piano stopped talking. They turned their heads, curious about the change in sound. One woman raised an eyebrow. A man tilted his head like a dog hearing a strange noise. Lucia didn't notice. Her eyes were still closed, and she was somewhere else entirely. She was in her grandmother's living room, sunlight streaming through lace curtains. She was in the practice rooms of her old conservatory, surrounded by the ghosts of 100 students who had chased the same dream. She was in her childhood bedroom, playing late into the night, while her mother listened from the hallway. The song built, layer upon layer. Her left hand found a groove, a syncopated pattern that made the bass line swing. Her right hand began to improvise, dancing away from the original melody, and then returning to it, like a bird flying away from its nest and coming back. The harmonies grew richer, more complex. She added seventh chords, ninths, unexpected key changes that made the simple love ballad sound like something from a smoky jazz club in another era. More people turned to look. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne glasses stopped in his tracks and stared. Lucia's fingers moved faster now. Not rushed, never rushed, but with a confidence she hadn't felt in years. It was like her hands remembered everything her mind had tried to forget. All those hours of practice, all those scales and arpeggios and etudes, all those performances under bright lights, it was all still there, stored in her muscles and bones, waiting to be released. She hit a high run, her right hand flying up the keyboard in a cascade of notes that sparkled like fireworks. Then she brought it back down with a deep, rolling chord that resonated through the entire room. The contrast was stunning, light and dark, high and low, joy and sorrow woven together in a tapestry of sound. By now, the ballroom had gone quiet. Not completely silent, there were still whispers, still the occasional clink of glass, but the loud chatter had died away. People were watching. Really watching. Some had moved closer to the piano, drawn by the music like moths to a flame. Others stood frozen in place, drinks halfway to their lips, afraid to make a sound. Lucia played on, unaware of the audience gathering around her. The music had taken over. It was pouring out of her like water from a broken pipe. Years of suppressed emotion finally finding an outlet. There was grief in those notes. Grief for the career she had given up, for the dreams she had set aside, for the girl she used to be. But there was also something else. Something brighter. A kind of fierce, defiant joy. A declaration that she was still here, still alive, still capable of creating beauty, even after everything she had lost. Her body began to move with the music. She swayed on the bench, leaning into the louder passages, pulling back for the softer ones. Her shoulders rolled, her head tilted. She looked nothing like the tired, invisible woman who had walked into the party 2 hours ago. She looked like someone possessed, someone transformed, someone who had finally remembered who she really was. The improvisation reached a peak. Her hands crashed down on a massive chord, and then she launched into a virtuosic passage that made several guests gasp out loud. Her fingers flew across the keys in a blur, hitting notes so fast that it seemed impossible for a human being to play them, but there was no hesitation, no stumbling. Every note was clean and precise, placed exactly where it needed to be. A teenage boy near the front pulled out his phone and started recording. He wasn't the only one. Within seconds, half a dozen phones were pointed at the piano, their screens glowing in the dim light of the ballroom. Lucia didn't see any of it. Her eyes were still closed, and she was lost in a world of her own making. The music began to slow. The fireworks faded, replaced by something tender and aching. She returned to the original melody of the love ballad. But it was different now. Transformed, she played it softly, gently, like a lullaby for a sleeping child. The notes hung in the air, each one a tiny miracle of sound and silence. Her left hand found a final chord, a deep, warm sound that wrapped around the room like a blanket. Her right hand played the last few notes of the melody, stretching them out, letting them breathe, and then silence. Lucia's hands lifted from the keys and came to rest in her lap. She sat perfectly still, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The music had taken her so far away that coming back felt like waking from a dream. Then she opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was faces, dozens of them, all staring at her. Some had tears in their eyes, others had their mouths hanging open in disbelief. A little girl in a pink dress was tugging on her mother's arm, pointing at Lucia like she had just seen a real-life princess. The room was completely silent, and then, like a wave breaking against the shore, the applause began. It started with one person, a man near the bar who brought his hands together slowly, deliberately. Then another joined in, and another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was clapping, the sound building into a roar that bounced off the walls and filled every corner of the space. Lucia sat frozen on the piano bench, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what had just happened, but she knew, deep in her bones, that something had changed forever. The applause washed over Lucia like a warm tide. She sat on the piano bench, her hands still trembling slightly in her lap, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The room that had ignored her all evening was now focused entirely on her. Strangers were clapping. Some were even cheering. A few wiped tears from their eyes. She felt like she had just woken up from a 15-year sleep. People began to move toward her. First one, then two, then a whole crowd gathering around the piano like she was a magnet pulling them in. Their faces were full of wonder, confusion, amazement. They looked at her the way people look at sunsets or shooting stars, like they had just witnessed something rare and unexpected. "That was incredible," said an older man in a gray suit. He was shaking his head slowly, as if he still couldn't believe what his ears had heard. Absolutely incredible. I've been to concerts all over the world, and I've never heard anything quite like that. A woman in a red dress grabbed Lucia's hand without asking. Where did you learn to play like that? Are you a professional? Do you perform somewhere? Lucia opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. Her throat felt tight, and her mind was still somewhere far away, lost in the music she had just played. More questions came at her from all directions. How long have you been playing? What was that song? I've never heard that arrangement before. Are you on any streaming platforms? I want to listen to more. Do you give lessons? My daughter would love to learn from someone like you. Lucia felt overwhelmed. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. For years, she had been invisible, just another tired face in scrubs. Moving through hospital hallways, doing her job, going home, doing it all over again. Nobody asked her questions. Nobody looked at her with wonder. She was part of the background, and she had made peace with that. But now, suddenly, she was at the center of everything. Aunt Carmen pushed through the crowd, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. She cupped Lucia's face in her hands and kissed her forehead. Mija, she whispered. Why didn't you tell me? All these years. Why didn't you say anything? I don't know, Lucia managed to say. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin and shaky. I thought it was over. I thought that part of my life was finished. Finished? Aunt Carmen shook her head. How could something like that ever be finished? That gift doesn't disappear just because you stop using it. The crowd around them had grown even larger. Even Anna, the bride-to-be, had made her way over, her fiancé by her side. She was staring at Lucia like she had never seen her before. Cousin, Anna said softly. I had no idea. I knew you played a little when we were kids. But this is something else entirely. Lucia looked down at her hands. The same hands that started IVs and checked pulses and held the fingers of dying patients. The same hands that had once made music their entire purpose for existing. It's a long story, she said quietly. We have time, someone in the crowd called out. Please, tell us. Lucia hesitated. She had never told this story to strangers before. She had barely even told it to herself, but something about the moment felt right, like the music had cracked open a door, and now there was no point in trying to close it again. She took a deep breath. I started playing when I was 8 years old, she began. My grandmother had an old piano in her living room. It was nothing special out of tune. Some of the keys stuck, but I loved it. From the first moment I touched it, I knew. I just knew that this was what I was supposed to do. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the waiters had stopped moving. Trays balanced on their hands. Listening. By the time I was 12, I was winning competitions. Local ones at first, then regional. My teachers said I had something special. They called it a gift, but it never felt like a gift to me. It felt like breathing. Like something I couldn't not do. She paused, her eyes distant. Lost in memories she had buried for so long. When I was 15, I got accepted into a conservatory. One of the best in the country. I spent 3 years there, practicing 6, 7, sometimes 8 hours a day. My whole life was music. I didn't have friends my own age. I didn't go to parties or football games or any of the normal things teenagers do. I just played, and I was happy. Truly happy. Aunt Carmen reached out and squeezed her hand. She knew what was coming next. During my senior year, I auditioned for a scholarship. A full ride to one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. And I got it. They said yes. They wanted me. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered something about a dream come true. But then, Lucia continued, her voice dropping lower. The room seemed to hold its breath. It happened suddenly. One day he was fine, working in his garden, laughing at his own bad jokes. The next day, he couldn't get out of bed. The doctor said it was serious. They said he would need constant care. Maybe for years. My mother was already working 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. My younger brothers were still in school. There was no one else. She stopped and swallowed hard. The memories were sharp, even after all this time. So I made a choice. I turned down the scholarship. I enrolled in nursing school instead. It was practical. It would give me skills I could use to help my father, and it would let me earn money to support my family while I learned. What about the music? Someone asked gently. Lucia smiled, but it was a sad smile. I told myself I would come back to it. Someday. When things got easier. When my father got better. When there was time. She shook her head slowly. But someday never came. My father passed away 3 years later. By then, I was already working full shifts at the hospital. Life just kept moving. And the piano got left behind. The crowd was silent. A woman near the back was openly crying, mascara running down her cheeks. For 15 years, I barely touched a piano, Lucia said. Sometimes, late at night, after a hard shift, I would sneak into the hospital chapel. There's an old upright there, nothing fancy. I would play for a few minutes, just to feel the keys under my fingers. But I never played like I used to. I was too afraid. Afraid of what? Anna asked softly. Lucia looked at her cousin, then at the crowd of strangers who had become her audience. Afraid of remembering what I gave up. Afraid of feeling the loss all over again. Afraid that if I let myself play, really play, I wouldn't be able to stop. And then I would have to face the truth. What truth? Lucia's eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. That I never stopped being a musician. That I just pretended to be something else because it hurt too much to remember who I really was. The words hung in the air like the final notes of a song. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, slowly, Aunt Carmen wrapped her arms around Lucia and held her tight. You didn't give it up, Mija, she whispered. You just set it down for a while. And tonight, you picked it back up. Lucia buried her face in her aunt's shoulder and, for the first time in years, let herself cry. The drive home that night felt different. The highway stretched out before Lucia in the darkness, the same road she had traveled hundreds of times before. But somehow everything looked new. The streetlights seemed brighter. The stars seemed closer. Even the hum of her old sedan's engine sounded almost musical. She kept replaying the evening in her mind. The feeling of the keys beneath her fingers. The way the music had poured out of her like a river, breaking through a dam. The faces of the strangers who had listened, really listened, to something she created. And then the tears, her own tears, finally released after being held back for so many years. By the time she pulled into her apartment complex, it was nearly midnight. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, but also strangely alive. Like a part of her that had been sleeping, had finally woken up and stretched its arms toward the sky. She didn't check her phone until the next morning. When she finally picked it up from her nightstand and looked at the screen, she froze. There were dozens of notifications. Missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, text messages from cousins she hadn't spoken to in years, and social media alerts, hundreds of them from accounts she barely used. Her hands trembling, she opened one of the apps and searched for her name. The video was everywhere. The teenage boy who had recorded her performance had posted it online the night before. Within hours, it had been shared, reposted, and commented on by thousands of people. By the time Lucia woke up, it had already crossed 2 million views and was still climbing. She watched the video with her heart pounding in her chest. There she was, sitting at that grand piano in her simple blue dress, eyes closed, completely lost in the music. The camera was shaky. The audio wasn't perfect. But none of that mattered. What came through was real, raw, undeniable. The comments section was flooded with messages. Who is this woman? She plays like an angel. I'm literally crying at my desk right now. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. How is she not famous? This is world-class talent. Someone, please find her and give her a record deal. Lucia sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone, trying to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. She was a nurse from a small town who worked night shifts and ate leftovers for dinner. She wasn't supposed to go viral. She wasn't supposed to be seen. But the numbers kept climbing. And the messages kept coming. Over the next few days, her life turned upside down. A local news station reached out, wanting to do a story. A journalist from a popular online magazine sent her an email asking for an interview. A music producer left a voicemail saying he wanted to talk about her future. Even the hospital where she worked heard about the video. Her co-workers gathered around a phone in the break room, watching their quiet colleague transform into someone none of them recognized. Lucia didn't know how to handle any of it. She had spent 15 years avoiding the spotlight, convincing herself that her music days were over. Now the spotlight had found her anyway, and it was brighter than anything she could have imagined. Aunt Carmen called every single day, bursting with pride and excitement. "I told you, Mija. I told you that gift doesn't disappear. Now the whole world knows what I've always known." Anna sent her flowers with a card that read, "Thank you for making my engagement party unforgettable. You deserve everything good that's coming your way." But the message that affected Lucia the most came from a stranger. It was an email from a woman in another country, someone she had never met and never would. The woman explained that she had been going through the hardest time of her life. She had lost her job, her marriage was falling apart, and she had been feeling hopeless for months. Then she stumbled across the video of Lucia playing piano at the engagement party. "I don't know how to explain it," the woman wrote. "But your music made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. It made me feel like beauty still exists in this world. Like there's still a reason to keep going. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for sharing your gift. It mattered to me more than you'll ever know." Lucia read that email 3 times, tears streaming down her face. This was why music mattered. Not the fame, not the views, not the record deals or interviews. It was this, the ability to reach across time and space and touch another human being's heart. She made her decision that night. She wasn't going to quit nursing. The work still mattered to her. She had spent 15 years caring for people in their most vulnerable moments. And that part of her identity wasn't something she wanted to throw away. But she also wasn't going to hide from the piano anymore. She wasn't going to pretend that part of her didn't exist. She would find a way to do both. It started small. A local jazz club owner had seen the video and reached out, offering her a Sunday evening slot. Nothing fancy, just a small stage in the corner of a cozy room, a decent piano, and an audience of maybe 30 or 40 people. Lucia said yes before she could talk herself out of it. Her first performance was terrifying. She sat down at the piano with shaking hands, looking out at the faces watching her. Some were strangers. Some were co-workers from the hospital, who had come to support her. Aunt Carmen sat in the front row, clutching a tissue, already crying before Lucia played a single note. But the moment her fingers touched the keys, the fear melted away. The music took over, just like it had at the engagement party. She played for an hour straight, mixing jazz standards with her own improvisations, telling stories without words, making the piano sing and cry and laugh. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't a grand ballroom full of hundreds of people. It was a small club with creaky chairs and dim lighting, but to Lucia, it felt like the biggest stage in the world. The Sunday shows became a regular thing. Word spread. The crowds grew. People started driving in from other towns just to hear the nurse who played piano like her life depended on it. A local newspaper did a feature on her. Then a national magazine. Then a morning talk show. Through it all, Lucia kept working at the hospital. She would finish her shift at 7 in the morning, sleep for a few hours, and then head to the club for her evening performance. It was exhausting. It was unsustainable. Her friends and family told her she would have to choose eventually, but Lucia didn't see it that way. To her, nursing and music weren't opposites. They were both about the same thing: connection, presence, being there for another human being in a moment that mattered. Whether she was holding a patient's hand in the emergency room or playing a melody that made a stranger cry, she was doing the same work. She was reminding people that they weren't alone. 1 year after that engagement party, Lucia released her first album. She recorded it in a small studio, playing every track on a piano not much different from the one her grandmother had owned. The album wasn't a commercial blockbuster, but it found its audience. People who needed it. People who listened late at night when they couldn't sleep, or early in the morning when they needed courage to face the day. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Lucia would sit alone at her own piano, a second-hand upright she had bought with her first music earnings, and play just for herself. No audience, no cameras, no expectations, just her and the keys. Just the girl who never really stopped being a musician, even when she forgot. She had set down her gift for 15 years, but she had finally picked it back up. And this time, she wasn't letting go.